Welcome to this session of Writers' Week. I am Linda Matthews, South Australia's Commissioner for Equal Opportunity, and I'm really delighted to be introducing our accomplished and talented panel today to discuss Dr. Germaine Greer's legacy, Life After the Female Eunuch. It might seem odd that we're doing this with Germaine present. Of course, such reflections usually happen after the person's no longer with us. But thankfully, as you can see, she's very much alive. But it's not an easy task for others to discuss her legacy in her presence. But that's exactly what I'm now going to ask our panellists to do. And we'll give Germaine I suppose we could call it a right of reply at the end. We're starting, our first speaker today is Robyn Davidson. Robyn Davidson won the inaugural Thomas Cook Travel Book Award for her account of her journey across the Australian desert with 4 camels, called Tracks. One thing Robyn confronted on this journey was how astounded people were that she was undertaking a journey into the wilderness, so typically regarded as a male rite of passage. To quote Robyn in Tracks, "And now a myth was being created where I would appear different, exceptional, because society needed it to be so. And that term, camel lady, had I been a man, I'd be lucky enough to get a mention in the Walloona Times, let alone international coverage. Neither could I imagine that coining that phrase, camel gentleman. Camel lady had that nice, patronising, belittling ring to it." Robyn, of course, has published widely in many other areas, and you will be able to read a lot about that in the bio. But could you please welcome Robyn Davidson?
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, I'd forgotten I'd written that, golly. Look, I've been well brought up, so I know that while it's perfectly fine to talk about someone behind her back, it's bad form to talk about her in front of her back. And besides that, Germaine is a mate of mine, so I don't even talk about her behind her back, except to defend her from all comers and to say how glad I am that she's still stirring the shit whenever she possibly can. Also, when I hear the word legacy, rightly or wrongly, I associate it with someone who's dead, or at least someone who's run out of oeuvre. And Germaine just keeps churning the legacies out. Also, she and I are more or less the same vintage, so it's difficult for me to think of the Female Eunuch as a legacy so much as a gift exchange. And perhaps the book seems like a monolith arising out of a barren plain to a later generation. But that's an illusion of distance. It didn't spring out of nowhere, it arose naturally, one could say organically, out of the particularly rich epochal compost of the late 60s, early 70s. And it was recognised instantly by those of us formed by that epoch as a particularly gutsy, particularly literate expression of ourselves. It was our book, along with many other books, films, cartoons, magazines, and art. They were all products of the ferment of the times. So rather than talk about my mate here, I would rather talk about those previous climatic conditions that could produce such a book, that made such a book more or less inevitable, that just required an individual of sufficient courage and capacity to come along and voice the zeitgeist. It must be, I can't remember when it was published, but it must be 30 or 40 years since I read The Female Eunuch, and I don't remember the actuality of reading it, only that I did read it. And the reason I think the reason I don't remember its specifics anymore is that they were so thoroughly assimilated as to become a kind of self-knowledge. What I do remember was the grieving realisation of the weight of the history of female oppression, the apparent inescapability of it, because it wasn't just something that oppressed from the outside, it had been internalised from day one of Homo sapiens sapiens consciousness. So it wasn't just a matter of changing social conditions, like, I'm sorry, can everyone hear? Oh dear, I am sorry. So it wasn't just a matter of changing external social conditions, like, for example, a woman not being able to get a bank loan or a mortgage. It was about the kind of psyche formed by the assumption that a woman was too stupid or too helpless or just generally too subsidiary to be worthy of handling a bank loan or a mortgage. That zeitgeist. It was passionate, serious, naive, hedonistic, arrogant, risk-taking, anarchic, childish, challenging. Everything had to be reinvented. Every standard had to be cracked open and tested. And what fueled it all was politics, a fundamental understanding of how power worked. It was in our blood. Those political underpinnings are often obscured by the retrospection to that era because of its flamboyant surface. But really underpinning it all was that really in-the-bone understanding of power relations. Now, I know that women of later generations often get cross with this referral back to the good old days. In fact, my own niece the other day complained to me that her lot had been fooled by us lot into thinking they could have it all. And in fact, she mentioned Germaine. When hell, you know, they couldn't even find a decent man to father their children. Well, we all acknowledge this phenomenon. It's as if there's been a great war and all the men have been killed off. But the truth is, it was like that then too. Because while there was a hell of a lot of sex going on, most of it was dull or bad sex, at least for women. And the idea of responsible fatherhood was in no way fashionable. In any case, I don't remember anyone saying or thinking that women could have it all. It was perfectly apparent to me, for example, that I could not have a family. I knew I had to grow myself up first. The one difference, I think a big difference in the generational mindset, is that we didn't necessarily aspire to the family or the marriage or even the children. What we opted for, and I speak for myself now, I mean I could easily be contradicted, but what I think we opted for was the idea of freedom and all the risks and losses and mistakes and indeed punishments that choice might involve. I remember the credo, there's no such thing as too much freedom, there's only too little courage. And I can't remember who said it, it might even have been me, I don't remember. But anyway, books arise out of their times, is what I'm trying to say, and take on the character of their times. And I find that a somewhat depressing thought, because what sort of equivalent landmark tracts do we have now? And I'd be really interested to know if younger women identify with any literary voices of their own time in the way that we identified with the Female Eunuch, because I may well have missed something. I've been living in foreign parts, so you know I haven't kept up with feminist literature. But a book that might spring to mind is something like Bridget Jones's Diary. Now, in some ways, it's a ridiculous comparison. But in other ways it's illuminating, because where the Female Eunuch was intellectually confident, bold, broad in its references and public in its aim, a book like Bridget Jones's Diary is small in scope, personal and anxious. It doesn't seek to shatter or change society, only to find a more or less comfortable place within it. I don't mean by that it isn't a clever or charming book, by the way, or that it didn't speak to its generation. I mean that the social compost it grew out of was so diminished compared to what our compost was, I suppose. But back to the publication of the book, I remember the kind of angry fear that showed itself at the time, and the kind of flack that Germaine had to catch. And it's a sort of scary, angry fear that you can sort of feel in a culture when a nerve is hit. I imagine that The Golden Notebook, Doris Lessing's book, had a similar kind of effect when it came out in the 50s. Lessing captured what many, many people, women in particular, were saying and thinking and even writing, but that the larger society simply could not hear. The larger society was deaf to that, so that when those conversations between men and women appeared in a book that became so popular, certain conventions of deafness were threatened. The book sent shockwaves through the social order and was hailed as a feminist tract, which certainly wasn't its intention, I happen to know. Yet the opinions, ideas and emotional responses contained in it were easy to find in everyday life. They were everywhere. So I think that's all I'll say for the moment, other than to raise my glass to my good friend and shit stirrer, and may she long produce legacies.
Thank you, Robyn. Our next speaker is Georgia Blaine. Georgia Blaine's latest book, to be published in March this year, is entitled Births, Deaths and Marriages, with the telling subtitle True Tales. The book promises to be a brutally honest account of love, marriage, families and death. The publicity says, "It wasn't until later years that I realised the obvious. The difference between us and the mythical normal family I was certain existed was in fact the fiction. There's always so much more, and it swims, shimmering beneath the surface, glittering with all the inherent contradictions of who we are, the changes that time brings, and the very elusiveness of a life slipping through our fingers." Georgia is also a much published novelist, and she was shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards and named as one of the Sydney Morning Herald's best young novelists. Please welcome her.
Thank you. When The Female Eunuch came out and was on the shelves in households all around Australia, I was about sort of 7 years old. And when I first heard that I was going to be on this panel, I remember very clearly going to pick up my daughter from school, who was about 8 years old, and I said to her, "I'm heading off to Adelaide Writers Festival and I'm going to be on a panel with Germaine Greer." And there are two things about her reaction that will probably tell you a little bit about the weird world that I come from. First of all, she was certainly the only kid in third class who knew very well who Germaine is. And secondly, she was incredibly impressed. So I kind of had that strange thing where I have grown up very much in a feminist bubble. My mother is a feminist and has been a feminist for as long as I can remember. I am a feminist, and I look at my daughter and she seems very determined to carry on the mantle. So because of this, I think I often have a slightly skewed view of life and a view that's at odds with the ordinary world. And I remember very clearly when The Female Eunuch hit the shelves, and the time that I was growing up, there was a huge sense of change in Australia, and that's one of the things that I really remember from my youth, from growing up in the 70s. And it was the time, as I'm sure everyone knows, of the Whitlam government and enormous reforms, and it was very much part of our household, because at that time my mother, who had been a broadcaster, was appointed as a commissioner on the Whitlam government's Royal Commission into Human Relationships. And I found it quite curious the other day when somebody said to me, "Your mother was quite an unusual woman for her time. She was a thinking woman." And I said that's actually not so unusual. There were plenty of thinking women, and there are plenty of thinking women. But I suppose what was unusual was that she had the ability, or she had the opportunity, to articulate her thoughts in a public forum. And she was part of this commission, and she was travelling the country, and all the kinds of issues that were coming up in her work and that were very much part of our growing up was looking at, I suppose, social change. So it was looking at things like legalising abortion, it was looking at things like the age of consent, it was looking at things like sexuality, all of those things. And this was very much part of the landscape of my youth. And then, as everybody knows, that era of reform came to a crashing halt in some senses, not in all senses. But the Whitlam government was dismissed, and I remember this very clearly because at that time this report was leaked to the press, and it was sensationalised and trivialised, and I remember also times of kind of going to the supermarket with my mother and people would actually spit on her in supermarket queues and say that she had, you know, no morals and shouldn't be bringing up children. But even though this era of reform had come to an end in one way, it certainly hadn't, in that I think it's had a huge impact, this time of the 70s, the female eunuch, on us as we live now. It certainly did in the immediate sense in my life then, and we certainly carried on at that time as though it hadn't come to a halt, because I still went off to school with my Women on Top badges and my Women Are Not Chicks badges, along with my Shame Fraser Shame badges. But I would feel, as a woman who grew up at that time when the Female Eunuch came out, that I benefited hugely from that legacy. And I feel very strongly that feminism is the framework in which I live, I work, I have relationships, and I am a parent. And in that sense, I feel I have had an extraordinarily fortunate life. And I think within the very close circle of my family and my friends and the work that I choose to do, not the work that I necessarily have to do, that feminism is simply a given in my life. So I think it was kind of different for Robyn than it was for me. And what I find absolutely fascinating now is to look at my daughter, who hasn't yet moved outside that very small circle, and she obviously will as she grows older, but she's still right there within that small circle, and to see how strong feminism is in her life. And I find it absolutely unnerving how she can deconstruct the sexual politics of just about everything that she sees on screen. You know, it astounds me, and in ways that I didn't do as I was growing up. And what I probably found the most unnerving of all was the other day I heard her in the back of the car with a little boy, telling this boy that she was never ever going to marry because it was a symbol of man's oppression over woman's, as she likes to say. And I immediately rang my mother and I said, "Oh my God, what have we created?" But I look at her and I am immensely curious as to what she will become. I'm very proud of her, but I'm also fearful for her, because I think it's all very well to live as a feminist in this feminist bubble, but I think sometimes when you hit the real world, you get a terrible shock. And I think she will get a terrible shock. And I think what I wanted to do just really briefly was to sort of close by throwing forward a few issues that I still see as kind of major issues of concern for me as a woman living now. And obviously these issues are kind of a grab bag, and they'll come up more in discussion later on. And they also come very much from who I am now, and I'm a woman in my 40s who's kind of just gone through that age of where women decide to have children or not to have children. So it's very much dictated by that. But I still think that whole question of a female identity is still very much defined by whether or not they have children, whereas I don't think it's the case for men, and I still see that as a huge thing. I still think that the issue of children and work is a very, very vexed one, and sometimes I despair at the lack of change that has occurred. I think when women have children, They often have to take different kind of jobs that are more flexible, or they have to bow out of the workforce for a period of time. And I think that affects hugely their independence at that time and can affect their independence in the future. And that, to me, is still a huge concern. I still think the relationship between, women's bodies and the world is a very fraught and vexed one. I find it hugely distressing, this kind of new wave of so-called feminism, where young women will talk about being sexual objects as being an empowering act. To me, that is not power. It is power defined by men for men, and it is not lasting power. I still think what concerns me hugely is that the issues that we're going to be discussing today are still seen as issues that should be discussed or are discussed by women. So, I would love to go to a writers' festival and be on a panel about families, or be on a panel about life post the female eunuch, and not have all women on the panel. I think, these are issues that need to be discussed by men as well, particularly now. So I guess for me, life post the female eunuch is still very much a matter of constantly questioning, thinking, and challenging every single dominant paradigm. And I don't think it's easy work, and I think it's work that often makes you feel at odds with the world, but I think it's work that we all have to continue. And I personally would love to see the feminist bubble that I have grown up in grow larger and larger and larger and larger.
Thank you, Georgia. Our next speaker is Deborah Robertson. Deborah's most recent novel, Careless, won the 2007 Nita B. Kibble Award, as well as the 2006 Colin Roderick Award. It was also shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Age Book of the Year, as well as longlisted for the Orange Broadband Prize. Deborah writes in a wonderfully reflective style, using her realism to, in her own words, hold a mirror up to society and say, this is what we look like, this is what we do. And I heard her talk about this book the other day, and I'm going to go and get a copy straight after. Deborah has also written a prize-winning collection of short stories entitled Proud Flesh. Thank you for joining us today, Deborah.
Hello. I've chosen to stand not to get away from Germaine, but because it helps me to breathe. Okay, I just need to check my timepiece. I think there's perhaps been more muddled thinking on muddled subjects by muddled people about Germaine Greer than any other person in recent times. An example of this is a phone call I had last night in my hotel room. A friend I went to school with, someone who I've known almost all of my life. We have very little in common these days, but we speak once a year on our birthdays, and she rang me for my birthday, and I told her what I was doing today, speaking on a panel about Germaine Greer, and she said, Germaine Greer, she wrote all that stuff about women's bodies, and then she went around the world but getting all these adopting all these coloured children. And I said to her, yeah, and fancy leaving Woody Allen for Brad Pitt. Oh, thanks for laughing, that relaxes me enormously. Look, I think one of the reasons that there is such a muddle around Germaine, and I hope I'm not just speaking for myself here, is that she has done something remarkably difficult for a woman writer, and that is that she has written through and spoken through lots of different forms. The book form, the popular media, which is really where change occurs so often. And she has exposed herself to so many modes and vehicles of delivery of her thought. And I think that that's hard in some ways because our experience, particularly through the media, is, you know, a mediated one. And so I think that that's partly what the muddle is. But I also think that Germaine Greer is perhaps like one of those ingenious squid that, you know, ejects that cloudy ink to defend from attackers, and I can well understand the need for that kind of ink and that kind of muddying of the ground around her in order to survive in a public arena. I would try to be as unmuddled as I can today, but I probably won't succeed. But I think the only way that I can do that is to try to speak personally. I do, however, want to say at this point that for me, Germaine Greer is not just about 70s feminism. It's about the work that she did through the 80s, the 90s, and into this century it is, isn't it? Because for me, Greer is a woman writer at work and never stopping.